Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's podcast is the second of 3 interviews with Kaya Bentley on psychopharmacotherapy. Kaya Bentley is professor of social work at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and has published extensively in the area of psychopharmacotherapy. Now, psychopharmacotherapy is a big, long word that refers to the treatment of psychiatric disorders with the use of medication. But as Kaya points out, psychopharmacotherapy is not just about giving people medication and calling it a day. It's an approach to treatment that acknowledges the strengths and limitations of medications. In today's podcast, Kaya talks about best practices for referring clients for psychiatric medications, resources for social workers interested in learning more about psychopharmacotherapy, and how social workers can think critically about psychopharmacotherapy for both adults and children. Now, in the first of these 3 interviews, Kaya and I talked about key concepts and the roles that social workers play in psychopharmacotherapy. In the third interview, Kaya talks about a recent qualitative research study she did to explore the meaning that medication had for residents in a psychiatric facility. All 3 interviews were recorded using Skype, and this is because Kaya was in Richmond, Virginia, and I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. During the interviews, I noticed some pops and hisses, presumably the result of network congestion or bandwidth bottlenecks, whatever those mean, but these were not enough to detract from the interviews. If you have questions or comments for me or Kaya about these interviews, please go to the Social Work Podcast website at socialworkpodcast.com. And now, on to the interview with Kaya Bentley and best practices and resources for psychopharmacotherapy. You identified 6 dimensions that constitute best practices for referring clients for psychiatric medications, and this was in an article that you wrote a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about what those best practices are.
Well, first of all, I really did like that article that came out in Best Practices in Mental Health, because I think that, well, a couple of things. The reason why the article got written was because in our national survey of social workers, of practicing social workers, we had just under 1,000. The second most frequent thing that social workers did was make referrals to physicians around medication, to do a medication assessment. The first most frequent thing, by the way, was discussing feelings about medication. So because social workers are in the real world out there, are making referrals, and I looked to the literature to say, okay, well, what's a good referral? What constitutes great social work practice with respect to referring? And basically, there's very little out there. And so we generated 6 ideas, kind of based on the literature, not much empirical research, but we felt like we could put out these 6 ideas. And the first one talks about establishing and maintaining collaborative relationships with prescribers. So difficult this day and age. But that notion of, in the article talks about referral highways, for example, is that you build a network of prescribers that you can work with, no matter if you're in a public setting or private setting or whatever. You develop sort of a network of people that you trust, and also you're also letting them know about the services that either you provide or your agency provides in terms of working with people. So that was one of the things, and how hard it is to maintain those lasting collaborations. Also, to be a great prescriber, referrer, you need to be able to share information about psychiatric medications, and that I talk in that part of the article about the heart of social work practice is problem solving, and so sharing information, helping people look at the pros and cons of medications, that just ought to be practically second nature. And then I do talk about helping clients manage the meaning of medication. This is what my more recent research has been about, is taking psychiatric medications is not a benign thing. I think someone said that. It is in the center of my sort of meaning results was that taking medication. Well, I have to find this because it's so good, Jonathan. So I may have to just look for a second where my little thing is. Okay, taking medication incites meaning, influences identity, and impacts life. And so, if that's true, then social workers training puts us in a perfect position to be able to help people manage that. What does it mean when someone tells you that perhaps you should consider having a medication evaluation? What does that mean to you? What kind of impact does it have on you? And then if you actually get to a prescriber and they decide that in conjunction with you that maybe you should receive a prescription and try it, what does that mean to you? What kind of impact does that have on you? Do you feel relief? Do you feel fear? What do you feel? And social workers should be helping people manage those things. In addition, social workers should be preparing, literally emotionally preparing, and sort of informationally, practically preparing clients for referrals. What can they expect when they go to see their prescriber, whether it's their OBGYN, a general practitioner, a nurse practitioner, a psychiatrist, whoever it might be. What can you expect? And again, how are you going to deal with that? And then I do make the argument, we make the argument that a great referral should be not steering. The term steering, which means sort of writing a name on a piece of paper and throwing a phone number at somebody. But a great referral really is following up and finding out the results of that attempted connection. And if we can discuss, I think the literature calls that cementing the connection. And then again, if there are legal or ethical concerns around decision making and coercion, or sometimes actually social workers have in our survey showed that they were particularly concerned around social justice issues. For example, like they had clients that needed medication, and then we know that there are some ones that are effective in populations, 70%, 75% effective, that we can't get access to, that the public mental health care system has waiting lists. And so what do you do when you have to sort of tolerate waiting lists? Or another less frequent one is, what do you do when you're not completely sure about the quality of psychopharmacological intervention being given out, that you have doubts about it? Those would be some other kind of ethical concerns that might come up. But the argument basically was, let's define excellent social work practice. Let's go ahead and expand that definition to mean being an excellent referrer.
I think everything that you just talked about makes so much sense, and it's listening to you talk about it. It's sort of surprising that nobody has talked about it before, or nobody has published it in one place before. And I'll go ahead and put up the link to the. I'll put the reference on the Social Work Podcast website and a link to the article, because it definitely sounds like something that social workers should have access to. I was wondering what other resources are available for social workers who are interested in improving their knowledge about psychopharmacotherapy or medications in general.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, a couple of different sort of categories. So I'll say one is, I'll just say books targeted to us. And so that would be psychopharmacology texts that are written for non-medical providers. So obviously, my own book with Joe Walsh is one of those books. It's basically half the book is a primer of psychopharmacology, and the other half talks about social work roles. But Brooks, Cole, and Thompson also publish other books like a psychotherapist resource on psychiatric medication by Bulow, Herbert, and Bulow. There's another one by Ingersoll and Rack called Psychopharmacology for the Helping Professions. And so there are some books written for us, and in our own field as well. There's Jim Gillespie has written one that comes out pretty regular. So that's one way of going. I really like, and when I teach courses on social work and psychopharmacology, psychiatric medication reference guides that are written for nurses, because they're usually written in an approachable language and not overly sophisticated in their terminology. So I like those. Then the other thing to look for is mainly review articles. So, the American Psychiatric Association puts out review guidelines, and those kinds of big articles that are summarizing the literature are good. I subscribe to a listserv, Medscape Psychiatry, and so once a week I think I get updates and opportunities to read up-to-date articles on what's going on. But clearly those are all going to have a certain sort of, I'll say, bias towards being pro-medication and suggesting that this is what people should be doing, and so you have to kind of recognize that. Two other places are, I mentioned, the personal account books. So books written by people who have struggled with emotional problems or mental illnesses that have written about their experiences, I think is a really good place for people who want to know more about medications and also be more compassionate. Be more compassionate social workers. And so I think to stay immersed in the experience of clients who take medications, one of the ways you can do that is to read personal account books. And then the final place would be there are some well-known, I'll call them trade books. So they're written for the public, but if and they're like, I'm looking at one right now called Straight Talk About Psychiatric Medication for Kids by Timothy Willens, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Wilens. And it's in its gazillion edition, and it's just a very, very approachable guide written by he's MD, but it's for parents and kids, and so it's kind of, I would describe it as trustworthy and approachable.
So you're really recommending a wide variety of academic and non-academic resources. Clearly, the academic resources make sense for folks in a professional program, but could you say a little bit more about why social workers should read these personal accounts?
Well, the personal accounts thing is really to keep the social worker immersed in that lived experience of clients. And so it's not that you're reading a personal account book to find out sort of the effectiveness rates of Clozaril or Celexa. Obviously you're not trying to garner that kind of information from a personal account book, but you are trying to gain insight and empathy into the experience of people who've struggled with the kinds of disorders treated by these medications, so that you can be a better social worker, so that you can be more humble and more appreciative. In addition to being that kind of social worker, what I'm implying to you about the being consumer of information is, my argument that we need, which I think everyone that writes about this in our field would agree, is that social workers, as I said, need to keep a critical perspective about medications. We need to understand the socio-political context in which medications are prescribed, the power of drug companies to define what treatment looks like, the fact that prescribing medications, has perpetuated sort of a medical dominance, and sometimes to the detriment of psychosocial interventions. And we need to not, as I said before, I'm not suggesting that we become cheerleaders for the use of medications. A critical perspective means understanding that if the effectiveness rates published is 70%, that means 30% of folks aren't being helped in a way that's considered clinically significant. And so let's not forget about those kinds of folks. And we can't forget about the men and women of goodwill who, in our field, like David Cohen, who has called attention to some of the biases in research. We can't turn our heads to that, but my argument is we can't turn our heads to the tens of thousands of people who've been helped. And in fact, my own study that I just talked about, that I completed, many of the clients basically described medications as a life-changing godsend, and that they were deeply grateful for having medications that were useful in spite of these incredible histories of struggling to sort of get to a place where they were helpful, with long histories of hospitalizations and terrible side effects and things like that. So we have to understand people are on a journey, and medications can sometimes help them along that journey, and sometimes, it's not such a pretty story. And I think if we go in, if social workers go in with that perspective, that critical perspective, that typical understanding the socio-political context, staying immersed in the experience of clients, then we'll be better social workers.
Well, you've convinced me. No, but seriously, I really like how you're advocating a critical perspective on medication, because I think social work sometimes it aligns itself with a perspective that the medical model and therefore medications are just bad, and that in order to be true social workers, we can't acknowledge the good in medications. But you're saying, you know what, there are a lot of different people out there and they have a lot of different experiences, and it's not up to us to say what is best for clients sight unseen. And so to keep an open mind to medications is a possibility.
John, I don't know if you'll use this or not, but I certainly remember when I was a brand new MSW student back in 1978, and I remember distinctly having an anti-medication kind of view. And I really do now believe that it was really tied up with my frustration about the lack of acknowledgement of the power of psychosocial interventions. And so somehow I sort of took it out on this other treatment option, which was more, quote, medical, certainly more biological. And I now think I've grown up and said, you know what, I need to practice some professional humility. Other professions and other kinds of interventions offer something to our clients, and I should know about it. And not to every client, but to many clients. So I think that giving up that sort of anti-medication view involves professional humility. Now, having said that I collaborate and I'm very familiar with people in our own field who really have stressed the and have argued that current clinical research around drugs is reeked or racked with bias, and that too often clients are given medication without other options. And you have to look at the grain of truth in that. For example, with kids, I've just did this article with Catherine Collins at Maryland, or book chapter actually, on kids, and the conclusion around kids is: are kids over-medicated? Yes. Are kids under-medicated? Yes. That both are true. That is, some kids are out there taking, being prescribed medications as a shortcut and without adequate assessment, without adequate exposure to all the options, particularly the psychosocial and behavioral interventions. So yes, that's true. Is it true that there are kids out there that have real behavioral and emotional needs that medication could help with, and yet they don't have access to it, or that, yes, that is true as well. And so that's quite a dilemma.
It is a dilemma. It's interesting that you answered both those questions. Yes. What publication is that coming out in, or what book is that coming out in?
That came out in Cynthia Franklin and Harris and Paula Allen Mears' book, The School Services Source Book, in 2006. So it was just a book chapter on psychopharmacology treatment with kids and adolescents. And basically we argued in that social workers that work with kids in medication, think of what they need to understand, Jonathan. I mean, they need to understand the controversies about use with kids, because parents and kids are going to come to them with questions about rumors they've heard, and worries about physical and psychological development, worries about what this will mean for the meaning, and identity of their adolescent kid or their other kid, which Jerry Florish in our own field has written about. What about backlash against medication in schools? Will this mean, is there sort of an anti-medication bias going on now that will really prevent kids that need help? What about off-label use? What about the use of research with kids? And so we try to, in that article, just make the argument again that social workers' knowledge isn't just about the name of a drug. It's really about the sort of social context that medication prescribing is happening right now.
It sounds like there's certainly room for a podcast on psychopharm and kids.
There might be.
Among other things. Okay.
Yes.
Well, this has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed this and appreciated you providing all of your insight and wisdom on this topic, and I suspect that our listeners will be similarly appreciative.
Well, thanks.
Please join us for part 3 of this podcast when Kaya talks about a recent qualitative research study she did to explore the meaning that medication had for residents in a psychiatric facility. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.